Under the pale breath of dawn, the forest stretched endless and solemn, its pines veiled in lingering mist, as though the earth itself wished to guard its secrets. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of resin and wildflowers hidden in the underbrush, each note like a whisper of forgotten prayers. A man moved alone through this quiet cathedral of trees, his boots pressing soundlessly into the carpet of fallen needles. Silas Winters. His name was carved into the silence like a mark of defiance, a survivor of war, of fire, of grief so deep it hollowed the marrow of his bones. He was scarred not only by the blade that had once sought to end him, but by the cruel theft of those he loved most. A wife whose laughter once filled the rooms of his heart, a daughter whose small hands once curled into his palm like blossoms clinging to their branch. They were gone, devoured by flames set by hands that carried neither mercy nor conscience. Yet Silas lived, as though cursed with endurance, and in that endurance he carried a vow sharper than steel. He would not rest until justice was carved out of the shadows. The mist swirled around his shoulders, drifting with ghostly grace as he paused, rifle balanced across one arm, listening. The forest was too still. No bird call, no scurrying of squirrels, only the sound of his own breath measured against the vast hush. His instincts, trained first on battlefields where cannon smoke blinded and bullets sang, then honed in years of solitary pursuit, tightened around him like a second skin. Something was wrong. 20 paces ahead, half buried among leaves, lay a shape too fragile, too human. She was young, no more than 20, her pale hair matted with dried blood, her throat marked with the purple bruise of violence. Yet she had been laid out carefully, hands folded upon her chest, as though someone had wished to dress cruelty in false reverence. Silas knelt, the hardened lines of his face softening with grief. Around her neck glimmered a silver pendant, a bird in flight, wings straining toward freedom. And pinned to her dress a folded note, 2 words scrawled in elegant hand, "Remember St. Louis." The message was not for her, it was for him. A cruel taunt, a reminder that his enemies had not forgotten, that they still watched, still plotted, still believed themselves untouchable. Silas's chest burned with a quiet rage, but he moved gently, lifting her as though she were his own daughter, carrying her deeper into the woods to a place only he knew. There, among 6 simple stone markers beneath whispering pines, he dug another grave. His hands blistered against the handle of the spade, but he did not stop, for the labor gave his fury direction, carved meaning from grief. He laid her in the earth, covering her with soil and silence, then pressed into the mound a small bouquet of blue mountain colline. "They think I will break," he murmured, voice raw against the cold air. "But I am closer now, and they know it." For 5 years he had haunted these hills like a phantom, building a cabin with his own hands, shaping wood and stone, not for comfort, but for purpose, for shelter between hunts. His life had narrowed to this mission, to follow the trail of women who disappeared, to uncover the names scribbled in hidden ledgers, to bring light into places men like Colonel Porter cloaked in velvet respectability. Yet, as he straightened, checked his rifle, once, twice, thrice, always thrice, something inside him shifted. He had worked alone too long. Perhaps, he thought, the time had come to change tactics, to descend from the mountains and confront the web of lies in Deadwood. But destiny often stirs in ways neither expected nor chosen. In a small, dimly lit room on the edge of town, Rebecca Morgan tied her dark hair into a neat bun before a cracked mirror. Her dress was threadbare, patched and frayed, the last decent remnant of her mother's life before death and hardship had hollowed their family. At 23, her face was neither dazzling nor plain. It was the kind of face people overlooked, until her amber eyes caught theirs and held them with a clarity both unsettling and unforgettable. She had lived her life beneath the weight of insults, dismissed as a burden, sold as an answer to debts. Her father's voice still echoed in her mind, sharp with disdain, too plain for a husband, too clever for obedience. And now, to him, she was worth only $50 and the forgiveness of a debt. Less than a horse, less than dignity. Yet Becca did not weep. She did not beg. Her mother had taught her long ago, in whispers stolen from the dark. Knowledge is freedom, and no one can take it from you. She remembered every word, every face, every moment, with a precision others called unnatural. That gift, once mocked, was her weapon now. She vowed silently that whatever awaited her, whether at the Golden Spike Saloon or the hands of Colonel Porter himself, she would not vanish quietly. She would survive, she would learn, and she would find the truth of her mother's disappearance, buried 13 years in shadows. Fate brought her to the steps of that saloon, her father's hand pressing her forward like cattle at market, her brother's eyes clouded with shame. The crowd gathered, jeering, whispering, mocking the girl sold for debts. Victor Caldwell, with his waxed moustache and greedy smile, reached for her chin as though she were already bought. Porter circled her, eyes cold, cataloguing her like merchandise. But she burned beneath their gaze, not broken, not meek. And then he appeared. Silas Winters, scarred by war and loss, stepped out of the crowd like a shadow-given form. His pale eyes fixed upon the scene, his voice cutting through the air. "Selling women now, Morgan?" His presence was unexpected, his timing uncanny, but his intention unmistakable. He bartered not with gold but with furs, prime beaver and mink, enough to cover the debt and more. Yet it was not payment that stunned the crowd. It was his words, her choice, her choice. No man had ever offered Rebecca Morgan such a thing. And in that instant, beneath the weight of jeers and threats, with Porter's gaze sharp as a blade, she spoke the words that changed everything. "I'll go with Mr. Winters." The crowd gasped. Caldwell sputtered. Porter's eyes narrowed, but Silas remained steady, his hand firm on his rifle, his presence unyielding. He did not touch her with ownership, did not bind her with expectation. He simply stood, offering freedom wrapped in the shape of a stranger's scarred face. And for Becca, who had been sold like livestock, that gesture was more radical, more romantic, more healing than any promise of riches. As they rode away together, the air growing cool and sweet with the scent of pine, Becca felt the world shift beneath her. She was not yet safe. Shadows still stretched behind them, and danger would follow. But she was no longer alone. The cabin awaited, half-built and scarred by storms, much like the man who made it. And within those rough-hewn walls, against the silence of the mountains, two wounded souls would discover not only the peril of truth, but the fragile, fierce beginnings of love. So let your heart linger here a moment longer, dear listener. Feel the warmth of a fire built not only from logs, but from courage, from survival, from the healing spark that flickers even in the darkest night. If this tale stirs something within you, if the tenderness of broken souls finding each other speaks to your own hidden ache, then let that feeling guide you. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so that this journey of love, healing, and hope can continue to weave itself into your heart. For the story is only beginning, and what lies ahead will carry both peril and passion, shadow and light, sorrow and the sweetest kind of redemption. And as dawn rises again over the Black Hills, we step softly into the next chapter, where the cabin stands waiting, and within it the fragile promise of something new. The trail wound upward through the Black Hills, a ribbon of earth cut into the side of the mountain, with pine shadows falling long and deep across their path. Rebecca clung lightly to the saddle behind Silas, her hands pressed against the rough leather, not daring to grip too tightly, though her heart hammered in her chest. The world behind her, the jeers of the crowd, her father's stony face, the calculating eyes of Porter, still echoed faintly, yet each hoofbeat seemed to carry her further from their grasp. She inhaled the sharp air, laced with resin and the faint sweetness of wild berries, and felt, for the first time in years, as though her lungs could truly fill. The weight of years spent in her father's shadow began to ease, though not vanish. Wounds do not vanish so quickly. They soften like scars beneath healing hands when hope enters again. Silas rode with the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to solitude, his broad back a wall against the wind, his silence not unfriendly, but contemplative. Every motion of his body carried discipline, checking the horse's gait, shifting the rifle with ease, scanning the woods with eyes that missed nothing. To Rebecca, he was still a mystery. A stranger who had stepped into her fate like a figure summoned from the fog, offering her choice when choice had been stolen from her all her life. She studied him in fragments, the scar carved along his jaw, the silver strands in his beard, the way his hands rested lightly on the reins, yet controlled the animal with certainty. He bore himself like a soldier, though one who had long laid down his flag, carrying only the burden of memory. When at last the trail opened onto a plateau, Silas reined in the horse. Below them stretched valleys painted in muted hues of green and gold, the air clearer, the horizon wide. Rebecca's gaze swept across the landscape, her heart swelling at the vastness of it. How different this felt from the narrow, suffocating rooms of her father's house, from the crowded saloon steps where men's laughter had mocked her worth. Here the world was boundless. She did not speak, but her silence was not emptiness. It was awe. Silas glanced over his shoulder, reading her face without words, and gave a single nod as though acknowledging her wonder before urging the horse onward. The cabin came into view as the afternoon waned, light slanting low between the trees. It stood unfinished but solid, walls of weathered logs fitted with care, a stone chimney rising stoutly at one side, smoke stains tracing its past labours. One wall remained open, covered with canvas to keep the wind at bay. To Rebecca, it was both humble and miraculous. Not the grand houses her father had once spoken of with pride, nor the gaudy facade of the Golden Spike, but something more honest. Built by hand, shaped by survival, standing because someone refused to let the wilderness swallow him. Silas dismounted, then extended a hand. His palm was calloused, warm, steady. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. He released her the instant her feet touched the earth, careful, respectful, as though to remind her she was free, not bound. She clutched her small bundle of possessions to her chest, the book of her mother's poetry, the ribbon, the knife hidden from her father, and felt the tremor of uncertainty. What now? Where did she belong in this raw, silent place? "It's not much," Silas said, his voice low, roughened by years of disuse. "But it will keep you safe." Safe. The word curled through her like a prayer. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim glow. The cabin was spare but orderly. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with a few books, dried herbs strung from the rafters. A bed stood against one wall, covered with a quilt patched in careful squares. She touched the fabric lightly, sensing the time it had taken, the human care woven into each stitch. "That's yours," Silas said simply. "I'll stay in the storehouse." Rebecca turned, startled. "I couldn't take your bed." His gaze was steady, unyielding, but not unkind. "It isn't a negotiation. Nights are cold here. Storehouse will keep me well enough. You've had enough taken from you. The bed's yours." Her throat tightened. She wanted to protest, to insist she was not fragile, not helpless. But beneath his firm tone, she heard something else. Not pity, but recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement of what she had endured. She lowered her bundle slowly onto the quilt and whispered, "Thank you." That evening, as twilight deepened and stars pricked the sky, Silas moved through his rituals with silent efficiency. He stoked a fire in the hearth, hung a pot of rabbit stew over the flames, and showed her where the coffee was kept. Rebecca, eager not to remain idle, gathered the few potatoes stored in a bin, slicing them into the pot. The act was simple, domestic, yet her hands trembled with the enormity of it, cooking in freedom, not under command, not for men who would leer and sneer, but for herself, for survival, and for a man who had given her a choice. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the crackle of fire and the low sigh of the wind against the canvas wall. Yet the quiet was not oppressive. It was companionable, healing, a space in which words were not demanded, but offered only when ready. Rebecca found comfort in it. She studied Silas in the flickering firelight, the lines of his face softened by the glow, and wondered what griefs hid behind his silence. She wanted to ask, but held back, sensing that some wounds revealed themselves only when trust had grown strong enough to bear them. When the meal was finished, Silas rose and checked the door, the shutters, his rifle, once, twice, thrice. Rebecca noticed the pattern, the ritual of it, born of habit and fear. "Always 3 times?" she asked softly. His mouth curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. "Always." He did not explain, but she understood. 3 times for certainty, 3 times for safety, 3 times for those he had lost. Ritual was a kind of healing too, she thought, a way to impose order on a world that had shattered. That night she lay beneath the quilt, the scent of smoke and pine filling the room, while Silas made his pallet by the fire. Rain began to whisper against the canvas, steady and soothing, and Rebecca let the sound lull her into the first unbroken sleep she could remember since childhood. In the quiet of the cabin, among shadows softened by firelight, she felt for the first time not like a burden, not like property, but like a person again. And as the storm deepened outside, 2 broken lives, scarred by loss and betrayal, found themselves beneath the same roof, not yet lovers, not yet even friends, But something had begun, something fragile as a flame in the wind, yet steady enough to kindle hope. The next morning, when sunlight broke clear and golden, Silas rose before dawn, as always. He left coffee warming on the hearth before disappearing into the forest with his rifle. Rebecca woke to its scent, the cabin quiet around her, and felt a surprising warmth bloom in her chest. It was not love yet, but it was healing, and it was a beginning. The days ahead would carry danger, secrets, and shadows of the past. But for now, on this first morning in the cabin, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, of fragile peace, before the world demanded more of her. And in that moment, she chose again, not surrender, not despair, but to live, to fight, and perhaps to love. The days unfolded into a rhythm neither of them had expected, a rhythm stitched from necessity and quiet moments that carried more tenderness than either dared name. Dawn broke pale over the ridges, spilling light into the narrow clearing where Silas's cabin stood. He always rose first, moving with the discipline of a man trained by years of war and loss. He would stoke the embers of the fire, grind beans into coffee with slow, deliberate motions, and check the rifle in his hands 1, 2, 3 times before disappearing into the forest. Rebecca would wake to the smell of coffee, to the soft warmth lingering in the hearth, and to the silence of a cabin that was beginning to feel less like a stranger's shelter and more like a fragile sanctuary. The work of survival drew them closer. Together they hauled logs to mend the unfinished wall, their shoulders brushing when they lifted heavy beams, their breath visible in the chill air. Silas showed her how to notch wood so it fit snug, how to caulk the cracks with moss and clay to keep out the wind. His hands, rough and scarred, moved with patience, guiding her without condescension. When she faltered, he steadied her, not with words that cut, but with a touch that reminded her she was capable. She had been told all her life that her sharp mind was a burden, that her hands were fit only for sewing or cooking, that her worth lay in obedience. But here, in these hills, she felt herself unfold. Knowledge was freedom, her mother's words echoing softly, and every log lifted, every fire tended, every trap set was proof that she was free, learning to live not at the mercy of others, but by her own strength. In the afternoons, Silas taught her to read the forest. He pointed out the faint trace of deer in soft earth, the subtle bend of grass where rabbits had passed, the hush that fell over the trees when a predator moved close. His voice was quiet, steady, each lesson offered like a gift. Rebecca listened with fierce attention, her memory imprinting every detail. What she learned in an hour she carried perfectly forever, and when she repeated his instructions back to him, word for word, his pale eyes softened with something close to admiration. It had been years since anyone had admired her for what she remembered, for the clarity of her mind. That simple respect healed something raw within her, like cool water over a wound left open too long. Evenings were their own kind of intimacy. After the day's labor, they would sit by the fire, the crackle of pine logs filling the silence between them. Sometimes Silas would carve, his knife shaping small pieces of wood into forms that bore the mark of a craftsman's patience. Sometimes Rebecca would open her mother's book of poetry, her fingers tracing the notes in the margins, her voice low as she read lines that spoke of love, of sorrow, of endurance. He listened, never interrupting, the firelight catching in his eyes as though those words reached corners of him long closed. One night, when rain beat against the canvas wall, Rebecca confessed she had seen the notebook Caldwell dropped, the list of women, the cold marks beside their names. "Catherine," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My mother's name. St. Louis, 1863. She did not need to explain. Her memory recalled it with merciless precision. Silas stiffened, his jaw tightening. He had known something, she sensed, but the grief in his silence told her more than words. When she asked if he had known her mother, his answer was heavy with shadows. Maybe. He spoke of St. Louis, of women who disappeared, of investigations cut short, of evidence that vanished because powerful men willed it so. The pieces fit too neatly, and the weight of it left them both quiet, staring into the fire as if it alone could burn away the truth. It was then that she noticed the letters. A box tucked within his trunk, filled with pages written in the same steady hand. She had not meant to see them, but her curiosity, sharpened by grief and memory, betrayed her. The letters spoke of Hannah and Lily, his wife and child. They spoke of dreams of a cabin finished, of lullabies remembered, of grief written as though ink could bridge the gulf of death. When Silas discovered she had seen them, his eyes hardened, his voice clipped. "They're just words on paper," he said. But Rebecca, with tears in her eyes, whispered back, "No, they're memory, and memory keeps them alive." Something shifted then, fragile and profound. He looked at her not as an intruder, but as someone who understood, someone who carried her own ghosts, who feared forgetting her mother's voice, her laughter, her scent of lavender. Their grief mirrored each other, different in detail, the same in weight. And in that shared sorrow, a bond deeper than words took root. The storm raged through the night, shaking the shutters, rattling the half-built wall, but inside the cabin they were not alone. Silas made his pallet by the hearth, the fire warming them both, and Rebecca lay beneath the quilt, listening to the storm's fury. She felt a strange peace, fragile but real, knowing that someone else bore her burden, that she no longer faced the shadows alone. Healing came not in grand declarations, but in the steady presence of another soul who refused to let her fall. Morning brought clear skies, the air washed clean by rain. Drops clung to pine needles, glittering like glass in the rising sun. Silas led her outside, rifle in hand, and placed the weapon into her grasp. "Time you learned," he said. She had watched her brother practice once, long ago, memorizing every movement, every correction. Now she stood with the weight of the Winchester in her hands, her body remembering as her muscles learned. Silas guided her stance, his hands steadying her shoulders, his voice low against her ear. "Breathe out as you squeeze. Don't pull. Let the shot be part of your breath." The rifle thundered, recoiled, jolting her arms. The shot went wide, splintering bark from a distant tree. She flushed, but Silas only nodded. Again, again, and again, until her aim steadied, until the tin cans on the fallen log toppled one by one. Her shoulder ached, her ears rang, but a glow spread through her chest, a sense of power, of possibility. She could defend herself. She could fight back. She was no longer the girl sold on the steps of the Golden Spike. She was something more. As dusk fell, they spread a map of the Dakota Territory on the table. Silas traced the trails with a calloused finger, explaining where Porter's men might be, where the law was weak, where evidence could be taken. Rebecca listened, committing every line, every mark, to memory. "You've been alone too long," she told him quietly. He glanced up, eyes shadowed, but she did not flinch. "We could do this together. My memory, your knowledge. They won't expect us." His silence stretched long, heavy as the mountains themselves. But in his eyes she saw the flicker of something he had buried years ago. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. The fire burned low, painting the walls in soft gold. Outside, the forest whispered, alive with secrets. Inside, a bond grew stronger, woven from grief, from healing, from the slow discovery that even in the harshest wilderness, hope could take root when two scarred souls leaned gently toward each other. And beyond their cabin walls, the shadow of Colonel Porter lengthened, his hand reaching, his eyes watching. The peace they had found was only a fragile reprieve. Soon the storm would return, carrying with it danger and revelation. But for now, in the glow of firelight, Rebecca and Silas allowed themselves a moment of stillness, not knowing that it was this bond, fragile, healing and quietly romantic, that would give them the strength to face the darkness that lay ahead. The storm settled over the mountains like a heavy quilt, pressing the world into hush and rain. By morning the sky was a single sheet of pewter, and the wind drew its slow breath around the cabin, testing shutters and seams with patient fingers. They were marooned together, not by danger, but by weather, and the stillness drew them inward, toward everything they had not yet said. Silas brought in armloads of wood beaded with rain, shook droplets from his hat, and set about coaxing a steady flame from the reluctant embers. Rebecca watched him as steam lifted from his coat in small, vanishing ghosts. She handed him a towel without a word. He took it with a quiet thanks, and the corner of his mouth softened. It struck her that his gratitude was never performed. It lived in him like marrow. They worked side by side, not to accomplish anything grand, only to render the day gentle. She mended a torn sleeve on one of his shirts with sure, delicate stitches, and he sharpened her small knife on a whetstone until its whisper across the leather strop sounded like rain on distant leaves. When the stew pot began to murmur softly and the cabin took on the warmth of cinnamon and smoke, Rebecca read to him from her mother's book. Her voice was low and even, careful with each line, and where Catherine had written notes in the margins, little stars beside certain stanzas, a looping yes where some truth had hit home. Becca let her fingertip rest as though pressing a pulse. "You read like someone keeping vigil," Silas said when she paused to turn a page. "Perhaps I am," she answered. "For her. For me." She hesitated, then added softly, "For you." The words did not startle him. He lowered his gaze to the curl of steam from his tin cup, as if memory sometimes rose the same way, warm and sudden, impossible not to breathe. "Hannah sang to Lily at night," he said. "Nothing fancy. Old songs. Sometimes just a hum, the kind that made the dark less large." He lifted his eyes. "I haven't heard a voice in this room in a long time that made the dark smaller." Her throat tightened. The storm had drawn the light close, and with it the perimeter of their lives. She set the book aside and folded her hands to keep them steady. "I used to be afraid I would forget my mother's voice," she confessed. "I remember everything else. Dates, faces, ink smudges. but a voice isn't written down. Some days I would try it aloud, pretending to be her, and it sounded wrong. I cried then, not because she was gone, but because of the way gone steals even the outline of a person. That stealing is its own cruelty, he said, and something in him opened the width of a breath. I write to mine because the paper holds what I can't carry in my hands. He glanced toward the trunk. He did not hide the gesture, did not wince at the truth of it exposed between them. You weren't wrong. Some things live only if someone remembers them. The rain tapped a long finger along the roof. For a while they said nothing. Their silence was not the hush of people at war with their thoughts, but the calm that follows the naming of them. In that quiet, Rebecca rose to tend the stew, tasting, adding a pinch of salt. She tore bread and warmed it on the hearthstone, then brought him a bowl. When his hand brushed hers in the exchange, the contact felt like a stitching, the smallest pain that promises a wound will close. They ate slowly. The window grew opaline with the steady wash of weather. Midway through the meal, Silas set his spoon down and nodded toward the canvas wall. Storm won't break till nightfall, wind's wrong for hunting, but the day is not wasted. He stood and crossed to the trunk, withdrawing a folded map and a piece of charcoal. He cleared the table with a sweep of his hand and spread the paper flat, weighting the corners with tin cups. She came beside him. The map's rivers and ranges lay like veins and ribs, a body of land waiting to be understood. He drew a slow line through the Black Hills, then circled Deadwood, Helena, Rapid City, small towns she had only heard men speak of in the thin patience between drinks. He moves people the way the railroad moves freight, he said, east to west and back again when someone looks too close. The golden spike is one spur. There are others. A ledger's no trophy. It's the railroad schedule for the soul. The image landed in her mind with the clean weight of truth. Then we disrupt the tracks. Only if we know where they run. He tapped the margin of the map, where space had been left for notes. What you saw in Caldwell's book, names, dates, places, turns rumor into measurements. It becomes real enough to nail to a judge's door. She repeated the names she remembered, letting them fall into the room like offerings. Elizabeth, Mary, Sarah, Catherine. Her mother's name did not tremble. It rang. She marked each on the map with a small dot. Next to some, she wrote a year in neat, careful script. When she finished, the paper looked less like a drawing of the world and more like an X-ray, something broken, showing where it had cracked. He watched her hand move. For a moment his expression, all watchfulness, restraint, thinned to something like wonder. You do it as if you're stitching a seam, he said. I suppose I am. She offered him the charcoal. You know where the fabric is weakest. He took it, and in 3 strokes drew a triangle between Deadwood, Rapid City, and the thin line of the trail toward Bear Gulch. Porter's men ride in loops. They think loops mean safety, but loops tighten into snares if someone knows where to pull. He was closer to her than he had been, close enough for her to see the silver at his temples where rain had left its work, close enough to notice a faint scent of pine and soap. Her heart, unsteady for reasons both new and old, found the cadence of his voice to follow and steadied itself there. Teach me the pull, she said. He nodded once. Tomorrow, if the storm lets us pass. His palm flattened briefly on the paper, as if what they wrote might steady the land itself. We'll ride to Rapid City. Marshall Hollister listens when something smells like truth. He tipped the charcoal toward Deadwood. But before we go, we'll need more than memory. We'll need what Caldwell keeps where velvet smells of whiskey. She understood him immediately. The notebook. The word was cold in her mouth, a coin pressed into a palm that has a bruise beneath it. You think we can take it? I think, he said, that the right moment is a bird that lands only once, and you don't clap too loudly when it settles. He lifted his gaze to hers. Ezra watches the town. He hears what money can't keep quiet. He'll know when and where to make noise. Ezra? She tasted the name as you might test a new tool in your hand. Old trapper. Knows the hills like his own grief. He returned the map to the trunk and added, almost as an apology, I would not bring another into this if it weren't necessary. But a man alone goes unnoticed only until he doesn't. A trio sometimes looks like chance. You trust him, she said, and it wasn't a question. She could hear it in the way he said the name, a small loosening in his chest, a kindred recognition. I do. He glanced at the window where the storm drummed. He lost his daughter to a river city and a man who wears respect like a fine coat. I've never heard him say Porter's name. He only says men like that. It is enough. The day drifted. When they grew tired of planning, they tended small tasks, the careful patching of a blanket's thin place, a new latch on the cupboard door that no longer stuck. She swept the floor. He mended a strap on the saddle. Their work made a music of small sounds, the soft brush of bristles, the sing of a needle through cloth, the low rasp of leather and awl. It added up to something that felt like life, plain, present, worthy. Near dusk, the rain deepened, the light dropped, and with it came a cold that slid beneath doors and seams. Silas added another log to the fire, then fetched a short slate from the trunk, the sort children used at a schoolhouse. He set it on the table with a stub of chalk and pushed it toward her. Bought this in Rapid City, he said, unexpectedly shy, as though offering a gift he wasn't sure was wanted. Meant it for... He broke off, and the rest of the sentence hung in the room like a ribbon uncut. It's better in your hands. She traced the worn wood edge with her fingertip. Thank you, she said, and the words entered her like a small, bright warmth. She wrote a name on the slate, Catherine, and then, below it, another, Hannah, and beneath that, Lily. She held the slate up so he could see, and neither spoke. The fire stitched light along the chalk lines. The names looked steady there, safe from water and time for one night at least. The wind rose. The canvas wall trembled. They both turned when, beneath the rush of sound, the forest offered another, the crunch of a foot on wet needles, the cautious snap of a twig, the breath of a man who had learned to breathe like trees. Silas's eyes lifted to the door, his hand fell to the rifle, and then his shoulders settled by a fraction. "Ezra!" he called, and the door opened on a current of wet air and an old man with rain in his beard. Ezra Johnson filled the frame like a story walked in from the weather, straight-backed despite years, eyes that had watched curves of smoke and horizon both, a walking stick worn smooth by long miles. "Evening," he said, stepping in sideways to keep the rain from the room, then closing the door and leaning his stick by the jamb. "Storm's got sharp teeth. I thought I'd warm my old bones where a decent man keeps a fire." "You found one of the rare places," Silas said, and poured coffee without asking, as if hospitality were the law a storm enforces. Ezra wrapped his hands around the cup. "Smells like someone knows how to make home where mountains would prefer to keep a body cold." His gaze went to Rebecca with a courtesy that held no curiosity like a blade. "Miss." "Rebecca," she offered, and when their eyes met she felt an odd recognition, as if grief recognizes its own, and bows. "Ezra," he returned, then nodded toward the table where the map lay folded. "You been sketching the world where Porter pretends to be its master?" He blew on his coffee. "I brought you a bit of news to tuck into your drawing." They gathered at the table. Ezra spread a newspaper he had kept dry in oilcloth, then smoothed a finger along a small column. "Grand Central hosts a private supper tomorrow. Railroad men, territorial officials, our colonel with the polished boots. He's arranging a line that won't carry lumber." Silas's jaw tensed. "More movement. Faster. Farther." "Quicker vanishing," Ezra said. "But men with big cigars don't like to sweat. While Porter's bowing and shaking hands, the golden spike will be lighter by 2 guards and 1 snake." "Caldwell," Rebecca said. The syllables felt bitter on her tongue. Ezra tipped his chin. "He keeps a little black book, likes to run his thumb along it like a rosary. Saw him drop it once and near faint like a lady whose lace caught fire." His eyes flicked to Becky. "You remember what you see?" "I remember," she said, and the room seemed to gather around that word. "Then tomorrow's your day," he said simply, as if telling a season to turn. "While Porter tells lies to men who like the taste of lies, we tug a thread from Caldwell's coat." He set his cup down and leaned back. "I'll light the street where the Grand Central sits. A wagon might catch fire in such a storm of celebration. Folks will hoot and run, and while they hoot, you'll walk." "Not run?" Rebecca asked. "Walking looks like belonging," Ezra said. "Running looks like guilt. 2 bodies moving where none should be moving is noise. 1 body with a second shadow, more natural." He slanted a smile toward Silas. "And before you tell me I'm too old for mischief, there's nothing left they can take I haven't already buried, let me make myself useful." Silas nodded, the argument he had prepared dissolved by the truth at Ezra's back. "We'll come from the alley," he said. "Back door. Service hall to the stairs. Office at the end of the 2nd-floor corridor. Painting over the safe. If Caldwell moved it, we'll smell the fresh plaster." Rebecca drew it in her mind, and then in the air, the way a person with perfect pitch hums a line to fix it. "Key, noise, 15 minutes, she said. "Dark lantern, no blood if we can help it." Ezra's eyes warmed. "You talk like someone born natural to this trouble. I do not mean it as offense." "I was born into a different trouble," she answered simply. "This one I choose." She glanced at Silas, and the small flare that passed between them lit the room better than fire. They made their final plans. Ezra would meet them at the old miners' cemetery at dusk with plain clothes and, if he could manage it, a fresh horse. They would leave their 1 gelding hidden in the pines above town. If the notebook was where they believed, they would ride for Rapid City through the night, bringing the ledger to a man whose badge was not for show. If anything went wrong, they would scatter to points agreed upon and meet in 2 days at the river bend where the cottonwoods leaned, because every good plan, like every good stitch, requires room for the fabric to pull without tearing. When Ezra rose to go, Rebecca surprised herself by touching his arm lightly. "Be careful," she said. "You are not old to those who need you." He inclined his head, eyes bright. It's a gift when the young remind a man he is still counted. He took his stick and the storm took him, and the cabin, left with his absence, felt double its size for a moment, and then exactly itself again. Night fell with weight. They banked the fire and lay down. He on the pallet he had made a meter from the hearth, she beneath the quilt that smelled of cedar and smoke. Sleep came like a slow tide to her, rising over the stones of worry, the reefs of memory. When she woke in the small hours, the storm had grown gentle. She watched the dark shape of Silas beyond the fire's low glow, his breath even, one forearm thrown over his eyes as if to keep his dreams from burning too bright. In the quiet of that hour, she understood that loving someone might begin not with thunder, but with the smallest of oaths. I will not leave you alone in your worst weather. Morning came clear and stunning, the hills new-minted after rain, every needle and blade jewelled with light. They moved without hurry, but with purpose, packing what could be carried under a coat, leaving behind anything that would slow a sprint. Silas checked his rifle 1, 2, 3 times, then took out a revolver and taught her its feel, a different weight, a different song. Only if you must, he said, and she nodded, understanding that must is a line written in darker ink than fear. Before they left, she lifted the slate again and added a 4th name beneath the others, Rebecca. He looked at it, and his eyes, which had seen men die and girls vanish and houses burn, softened with the realization that a name written in chalk can be a promise to the living too. They rode from the cabin when the shadows were small, the trail still damp, the air sweet with the cold scent of rinsed stone. The world felt sharpened, as if someone had honed it on a wheel. As they crested the last rise from which his clearing could still be seen, Rebecca turned in the saddle. The cabin sat square and patient among the pines, the canvas wall shining a pale, clean white against all that green. It looked like a held breath, unfinished, waiting. She pressed her palm to her skirt where her mother's book rested, then let her hand fall to the place over her heart where the names lived. Beside her, Silas glanced once back, then forward, as a man does who knows both what he has been and what he means to be. The horses stepped carefully onto the main trail. The day opened, long and bright and full of risk. By dusk, they would stand among headstones and meet a friend. By night, they would slip into a room where velvet tried to cover iron. By dawn, if they were lucky and if courage held, they would ride toward law with a ledger that could untie a net of years. Between now and then lay all the ways a heart can break and mend and break again. But as the trees parted and the first ribbon of road appeared far below, Rebecca felt a deep, steadying warmth spread through her. It was not the fire's heat or the sun's. It was the warmth of a choice honored and a hand offered without claim. Healing often moves like that, quiet as breath, sure as a step taken beside another, and with each hoofbeat, their 2 paths, once separate as 2 rivers, braided a little tighter into one. They left at first light and let the horses pick their way down through the combed ribs of the hills, keeping to deer paths where hoofprints vanished into old needles. The storm had polished the land, everything seemed sharpened, the air bright as cut glass, the pines stitched with pearls of water. They spoke little, not because they had nothing to say, but because their silences had learned to carry meaning. The way Silas's hand rose when he heard a jay's alarm, the way Rebecca leaned when the trail tilted, trusting his balance as much as the geldings. the way their eyes met when the world opened and a valley lay below them like a promise no one had yet broken. By noon they reached a saddle high enough to see the thin chalk line of road that would flow them toward Deadwood by evening. Silas called a halt beneath a granite shoulder that made a sheltering curve against wind. He unsaddled, checked the cinch and rigging as if these small fidelities could add up to a life saved later, then divided hardtack and a strip of smoked rabbit. Rebecca drank from the canteen and watched the far country through the notch of her fingers. Her attention did not wander, it gathered. She was learning how the land spoke, where shadows fell first, how ravens spun circles over what didn't belong, how sound carried when the air was damp. "Your brother taught you to load," Silas said at last, not looking at her, but at the line of firs that stitched the ridge. "He taught himself," she answered. "I stood in doorways and remembered what he forgot." "You do not forget." It wasn't a compliment. It was an acceptance. She wiped the canteen mouth, handed it back. "There's a kind of mercy in forgetting," she said. "It softens the edges. I don't have that." "I have edges." "You also have shape," he said. "Edges without shape cut anything they touch. Yours hold." She folded that into herself the way a person takes a blanket and makes it warmer by what they add. He didn't flatter. He named. The naming steadied her. In the afternoon the weather changed again, as quickly as moods do in a town square. Cloud shadow gliding over pines, a breath of cool running up from a drawer where snow never fully melted. They descended, weaving into darker timber, and the world seemed to move closer, the branches lower, the path thinner, until their horses' ears brushed needles and their knees took the bumping of hidden stone. It felt as if they were entering a room where secrets had been kept for years and where nothing spoke until you proved your intentions. They were close to town when Silas drew up and lifted his hand, palm back. The gelding stilled. Rebecca felt her own body obey a sign that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with him. And he slid from the saddle, put his ear to the ground, then straightened and scanned the slope below. "Two riders," he said. "Slow, talking like men who don't believe the woods have ears." He worked the gelding off the trail and into a pocket of young fir. Rebecca followed, trusting the way he parted branches to leave no mark. They stood with the horses' breaths going quiet as sleeping animals, and the voices came plain as if a wall had thinned, men speaking idly of a meeting at the Grand Central, of how the colonel liked his whiskey, of a wagon ordered for a demonstration, the word drawn out with an ugly laughter that tried to sound brave and only sounded cruel. The voices passed. When silence returned, it felt heavier, as if it had been used and needed to rest. Silas waited longer than seemed necessary, another lesson she stored, and then eased the gelding forward. Where the trail widened, he let their pace quicken until the air moved around them again. At the rim above Deadwood they stopped among pitch pines that overlooked the town, like ushers who would not allow anyone in without a good reason. Smoke braided from chimneys. A piano's bright notes, too jaunty for the hour, busted out of a saloon window and then fell back, as though even music understood there were lines it shouldn't cross at midday. Rebecca studied the streets with a patience that surprised her. Her father might be drinking already. Caldwell would be at his desk or on his rounds. Porter, she tried the thought and let it go. Porter was always where he wanted to be until someone else made that untrue. "Remember what Ezra said," Silas murmured. "Belonging is a kind of cloak. We do not skulk. We appear to be expected. Then we should look like the sort of people no one thinks twice about," she said, which is to say, almost everyone. He smiled with his eyes and not his mouth. "Cemetery by dusk," he said. "We go in as the day changes masks." They sheltered the horse and slept an hour the way the woods teach you to sleep, propped, listening, river-cold air in the nose, one eye open even if it's closed. When Rebecca woke, the light had thinned to that ache of colour the sky performs before it surrenders to lamps and fires. They walked down together, their bodies adjusting to street, to sound, to the brass of voices and the clatter of wheels. It would have been easy to feel small in such noise, but Rebecca felt narrow instead, like a needle being threaded toward a hole only one thing could pass through. Ezra waited among the leaning markers, hat in his hands, as if visiting his dead. He had 2 bundles under his coat and a 3rd horse at his rein, a wiry bay with the look of an animal that had taught itself to live. "Put these on," he said without preface, and handed over clothes that belonged to no one in particular, a dress the colour of tea and dust with a shawl that could cover hair and intent both, a miner's jacket and cap with sweat already written into the lining so they smelled like history instead of plan. Rebecca changed behind a tipped stone. When she stepped out, she did not disappear, she multiplied. She could be any woman on any errand that allowed a person to walk fast without being noticed. Silas rolled his sleeves under the jacket and pulled the cap low, and his edges softened. He lost the silhouette of his mountains and took on the straight lines of a man who could be found in a chair under a lamp bent over cards and quiet luck. Ezra showed them the street as if it were a map similar to the forest's. "Here's where drunks stumble," he said, pointing with his chin. "And there's where gentlemen pretend they don't know where they're going. 2 of Porter's dogs by the Grand Central door, one bored and one eager, neither useful if the other blinks. Back alley behind the spike is clean now, kitchen's noisy. Caldwell's on the floor till 9, then sheers off to count. He keeps a man by his door when he's nervous. He's nervous lately." "You'll start your trouble at 9, Silas said. "I'll start it when the mayor lifts his glass," Ezra said. "Timing looks better when it looks accidental." He gave Rebecca a small sheath and a small knife to fill it. "Not for foolishness," he said, "for untying knots made in a hurry." She slid it into her boot, a weight she barely felt and could call to mind without looking. Silas passed her the dark lantern, its shutter ready to claim light and deny it. She tested the slide with her thumb until the small action was memory. They entered town in a stream of bodies that were neither special nor unseen. The Grand Central's windows cast squares of light onto the street. Shadows moved behind lace. Laughter bent around fitful silences. When the carriage pulled up with men in coats too heavy for the weather, Ezra was already a figure farther down, where a wagon accidentally discovered its axle had an opinion about fire. People love to watch danger when they believe distance is protection. They gathered, men, boys, women leaning from windows. A cheer went up at nothing in particular, and then again at the way it felt to hear your own voice join others. "Now," Silas said, and they were 2 shadows lengthening into an alley. The back door of the Golden Spike had been painted hurriedly to look cleaner than it was. He set to its lock with the focus of a man who trusted his hands because his hands had proven worthy when other things had not. She watched the alley mouths the way a cat watches, by listening with the skin of her face as much as the drum of her ear. The click came like a toe on a stair you've climbed in the dark 100 times. Inside, heat from the kitchen brushed them in one stroke. Then the corridor swallowed it and replaced it with the breath of shut rooms where people do things they don't want written down. They climbed. At the top of the stairs, the hallway rolled like a carpet no one bothered to beat. She knew the door they sought before he pointed, its gold letters too careful, their edges too crisp. He listened. He tasted the lock. It yielded reluctantly, and then, all at once. The office was the faith of a certain kind of man made wood and glass. A desk too big, a painting that flattered the wall, a safe hidden as an idea you hope no one else has had. She crossed to the desk, he the painting. The light from the dark lantern made a clean pool on each thing it touched and left the rest uncommitted to meaning. The first drawer gave her a false book, a ledger that pretended to be ordinary and wasn't. She pried not with force but with insistence. Inside lay what she had seen only in the flash of a dropped object, a black notebook, its leather worn smooth where a thumb had worried the edge. She did not open it immediately. Her breath steadied first, then she lifted the cover. Names, neatly written, dates, sums, places where people were treated like chattel and then like numbers. She did not read them to become lost in grief. She read to hold them. She set them where nothing could tumble them again, inside the exactness she carried like a candle that never burned down. Catherine Morgan, 1863, St. Louis. Eliminated. The word did not make her flinch this time. She let it be as awful as it was, and then moved past it to collect the rest. Hannah Winters. Lily Winters. A year like a fist. Eliminated. She did not look up. She did not speak. She gave her eyes to the task, and when she closed the book, her hands were steady. Silas had the safe open now, breath going slow, as if he had taught his lungs to mimic a clock so his fingers could hear what wheels and tumblers argued about. Money lay inside, papers that smelled like law until you read them. He took nothing that glittered. He took what would not be believed without a ledger to teach belief. When she touched his sleeve, he looked at her and did not ask. He took the book as if it were a human being, slipped it inside his jacket, and buttoned it not with panic, but with care. They heard the commotion before they saw it. A wave of sound travelling up from the street, the kind that meant people were not sure whether to prefer fear or joy. They moved back into the corridor, and the corridor gave them back to the stair. On the service landing, a girl in a dress the colour of fallen peonies stepped out of the kitchen with a tray she wasn't carrying. She saw them. She saw their clean intent. Her face had learned to flatten quickly when something sharp approached, but she let it have shape now. "Back door's clear," she whispered. "If you move like you belong to the night." "Thank you," Rebecca said, and wanted to offer more, name, promise, some small proof that not everyone looked away. She added only what mattered right then. "We won't fail you." In the alley again, air struck their faces like water. The glow at the Grand Central flickered strangely. Ezra's flourish had gone from accident to story. Silas relocked the door. They moved with the pace of people who must reach a place that is either safe or only safer. The bay horse had opinions. Ezra liked him because of that. He waited in the black seam behind the blacksmith's, eyes alight under the brim. "Got it?" he asked, like a man asking if bread rose. "Got it," Silas said. They did not waste the night by staying in it. They mounted and gave the horses their heads. The road out of town looked softer than it was, but hooves find firmness in the dark when asked kindly. The notebook, warm now from the heat of Silas's body, thudded once against his ribs as if it had a heartbeat of its own. They might have outrun news, had news not been given horses of its own. Halfway to the first ridge, a shout lanced the air from behind, the kind that makes even a person who has done nothing wrong look for a place to tuck the truth. Rebecca did not look back until Silas told her to. Then she risked one glance. 3 riders, too hungry to hide their intentions, coming hard. Ezra veered off left at a trot that sounded like nothing at all, the bay's ears flicking as if choosing music. "I'll give them a melody they can't resist," he called softly, and was gone, a shadow deciding to be on someone else's mind. Silas reined toward the right-hand fork, the one that posed as a bad choice to those who didn't know it. "If they split," he said, "you ride the true road. If they all follow me, you ride anyway. You don't slow for anything but a river too wide to name." Her hand found his forearm. The touch steadied her, and she suspected it steadied him. "I'll meet you where the cottonwoods lean," she said. It was not a wish. It was a decision. He leaned across and pressed his mouth to her forehead, not as a farewell, but as a benediction. "Ride," he said, and then he took the noise into the dark, and the dark took him, because it knew him already. She chose the road, not because it looked safe, but because it was necessary. The gelding breathed deeper and stretched. She lowered into the saddle the way a bird lowers into its own air. The land, which had felt like a companion all day, turned into a partner, giving a little where she needed it to, firming underfoot when panic tried to take the reins. She spoke to the horse without speaking and promised both of them that courage would be taken in small sips until it tasted like water. By the time the moon cleared the edge of the hills, Rapid City's first lanterns were shaking their light into the night, and the road widened enough for fear to stand alongside hope. She rode straight to the marshals and did not apologize for her arrival breaking the hour. Her knock was not a plea. It was the sound a new chapter makes before it begins. Inside, she placed the notebook on a desk where law and weariness met and learned each other's faces, and she laid out names as if she were setting a table for the dead. She did not lower her eyes when the page with her mother's name turned up. She held it still, so the man with the badge could see the work he was being asked to do. Shouts cracked from the street, and glass went like ice on a river when it decides it will move now, and men ran, because running was sometimes the only prayer they remembered. She did not duck until ducking meant standing up again afterward. When the noise thinned, the room returned to itself, and the man at the desk slid the ledger into a drawer that looked too small for what it now held. "We'll find him," he said. He meant Silas. He meant the man who had ordered too many endings. He meant all the things a good man means when he says a short sentence because he knows how much it must carry. She let her breath go and glanced at the door, and the door was only wood again. The night had been pledged to justice. The morning would keep the promise, or ask for a higher price. She did not close her eyes when she prayed for the first time in years. She looked at the names on the slate of her mind and said them as if names spoken were lanterns lit, one by one, along the road that led out of darkness. When dawn began to loosen the black from the blue, she stood at a window in a room the marshal's wife had offered her, and watched the town learn the day. Somewhere in the hills, hoofbeats sounded in a rhythm she could not hear but chose to believe in. She had not expected to understand it this quickly, but she did. Loving a person is also learning how to hold your place while they ride through their worst weather and making ready the fire that will warm them when they find their way home. And when a knock came at the back door hours later, 3 firm, measured raps, a habit trained into bone, she didn't run to it the way fear urged. She walked to it the way belonging had taught her. The door opened, and what she saw first was not blood, not bandages, not the tilt of a body that had been asked too much of. It was the look in a man's eye when his vow, carried day after day across cruel country, finds a hand to pass into and does not have to be borne alone any more. Morning opened like a careful hand over rapid city, light easing along rooftops and catching on the rims of buckets at doorways, on the polished brass of a sign, on the face of a clock that had kept the town's faith through rougher seasons. Rebecca stood at the window of the marshal's spare room and watched the day arrive to ordinary things. Broom bristles dragging dust to the street's edge, steam lifting from a cookhouse, a boy jogging with a sack of bread that swung like a pendulum from his shoulder. Ordinary felt like a rare gemstone after the night they'd carried. She let her breath move in and out until it matched the rhythm of the town. The ledger weighed the whole building with its small, ruthless pages. It was safe now, locked in a drawer whose key Hickory had tied to his belt with twine, then tucked beneath his vest as if an extra layer of ordinary would keep out harm. The judge was due on the morning stage. Men waited already on the boardwalk, boots polished the way a body polishes itself when it knows it will be looked at. She thought of names: Catherine, Hannah, Lily, and the others whose syllables didn't belong to her, but had been entrusted to her memory. She whispered them softly, and each took its lantern place inside her. A soft knock came. Mrs. Hollister pushed the door and entered with a tray, coffee and eggs, and a slice of bread with honey glinting in a thin, patient sheen. "Eat!" she said cheerfully, as if the instruction itself had healing in it. "You'll give way if you try and stand on nothing." She set the tray down and fussed with the curtain tie, tightening it 1 inch as though small order could coax a larger piece into the room. "Thank you," Rebecca murmured. She ate because she had been asked to be strong by people who knew strength wasn't magic, but made, bite by bite, breath by breath. The marshal fetched her when the judge arrived. Judge Harmon looked like granite at a distance, austere, carved, yet up close his eyes held the wet brightness of someone who still loved the world enough to be angered by what men did to it. He didn't shake her hand. He placed his palm over his heart and inclined his head. Respect mattered, and it released something tight in her chest. They walked to the back office, and the ledger was brought out as if it might bruise. Rebecca opened it to the first page and began. She spoke without ceremony, laying a path the judge could walk with his mind. Names, dates, transactions that pretended to be commerce while tallying human lives. She did not dramatize what was already obscene. She did not soften it either. When she reached her mother's name, she set her finger beside it. Judge Harmon did not look away. He drew a long breath and let it anchor itself before he nodded, slow and sure. "This will do," he said. "This will more than do." "Warrants," the marshal said under his breath, as if a prayer could be convinced to move faster if spoken softly. "For Porter, Caldwell, and every man whose hand this ledger touches," the judge replied, "and for any official whose name repeats like a refrain." His mouth tightened. We will see which uniforms are worn for honor and which for purchase." The town seemed to tilt slightly then, as if law had shifted from posture to motion. Hollister's deputies slung on their coats with new urgency. Runners left at a trot to gather men whose trust could be relied upon. The judge wrote quickly, the scratch of his pen a firm, dry sound. Rebecca watched his hands, old but steady, and had the sense of stones being set one into another to make a foundation that would outlast weather. A man burst in with breath snagged on his ribs. "Trouble," he got out. "Porter's men, 4 of them, down the street, asking after a mountain man with a scar and a girl with amber eyes." "4?" Hollister asked. "4 that I could count without making them count me." The messenger swallowed hard. "Some say they came from the North Road. Others say they were seen peeling from the hills at dawn." Rebecca's hands went cold. She saw Silas in her mind as he had leaned across the space between their horses and set his mouth to her brow. It had been a vow and a benediction both, and vows sometimes hurt like stitches while they held flesh together. "He led some of them away," she said. "Ezra took the others." The thought steadied her in one place and made her shake in another. "If he's taken—" "We'll bring him home," the marshal said, with that particular softness of men who don't promise what they can't deliver, but promise to spend themselves anyway. "I know where they'd hold him," came a voice from the doorway. Ezra stood there, rain-dried now, a new weariness laid across his features as though a long, invisible yoke had been shouldered again. "Not in town where a badge can find them. A private cabin near Bear Gulch. The colonel's notion of privacy. If he's got Winters, he'll have him there and then move like water to a place where papers don't mean much." Hollister weighed it, eyes narrowing the way a man sights along a barrel. Judge Harmon looked from one to the other. "You have my authority," he said simply. "Take who you trust. Bring back a man the law will need, and bring back your own." Ezra added, "If Porter knows the ledger's in law's hands, he'll tie off loose ends before he runs. He'd brag to Winters on his way out. That's the kind of man he is. An emptiness that has learned to talk." Rebecca found her breath and stood straighter. "I'm going," she said. "If he's hurt, he'll hear me before he hears any man." Her voice did not tremble. It was a clear bell. Hollister opened his mouth to argue. The judge raised a palm. "Take her," he said. "Not into the teeth of it, but near enough to call someone back to himself." They rode within the hour. The sky carried a pallor that belonged to days when decisions are made, as if the light itself wanted to be neutral. Ezra led along the packed earth that turned slyly to stone, where a wheel would falter. He knew where to step, so a horse's hoof found surety under the soft. Rebecca kept the gelding's shoulder aligned with the marshal's stirrup and listened to the forest the way she had been taught, with her ears, with her eyes, with the skin on her neck and the map in her mind. Every mile ticked inside her like a metronome of resolve. At Bear Gulch, the land narrowed into a throat, and then opened on the far side into a small hush of clearing, where a cabin sat a little too proud, the way money often builds among trees, bigger than it needs, with a porch that looked like a thought of leisure had been nailed to it. Ezra raised his hand. They dismounted without talk. Hollister split them with 2 fingers, he and the deputy taking the front, Ezra and another circling to the rear, Rebecca staying tucked in the fold of a big rock with Harrison at her side, his boy's face set to the mantle of a man's steadiness. Gunfire broke like a string popping under tension. 1, 2, and then a hail that made the trees clench. Rebecca knelt, palm flat to stone, the sound vibrating through her bones. She tasted metal at the back of her mouth and prayed without finding words. Then the hail faltered, became a snarl, and then went quiet in a way that felt like a room full of men remembering they had hearts. A minute passed, long and complicated. Another. Harrison glanced at her, and she nodded once. "We wait." The signal came from the deputy, hand raised and waved low, safe enough to approach. She went with Harrison, and the clearing presented itself. 2 men face down in the dirt, one bleeding from the shoulder and cursing softly as though the words might stitch him closed, and the cabin door shouldered open on a trap of rope that still swung in a tired arc. They had missed it by care or luck. Someone had sprung it early. Inside, the place smelled like expensive whiskey and hastily doused lamp smoke. There was a chair in the back room where a man had been kept, and a table near it with a water cup upturned. On the small table lay a folded note addressed to her in a hand she did not know. She opened it with a steadiness she didn't feel and read Porter's clean script. "Bring the book to Black Rock Canyon by midnight if you wish to see him breathe again. Come alone." Her body went colder than the water in a mine shaft. She passed the paper to Hollister. "Black Rock," Ezra said softly, as if reading a prayer's first words. "He likes the echo there. Men who imagine themselves large prefer a room that agrees." "An ambush," Hollister said, "but not tonight. He expects time to be a lever and fear to be a rope. We'll use both against him." He looked to Ezra. "Can we reach that canyon before he arranges his chairs?" "We can if we don't argue about it another breath," Ezra answered. They moved, the urgency now clean and useful. Rebecca kept close, the gelding grateful for the work. The trail into Black Rock Canyon wound like a question men had been asking since the first ore glittered in these hills. The moon came up late and fat, a blunt lantern. They tied off the horses in a fold of brush and crawled the last 100 yards to a lip of rock that gave them the scene below. The black mouth of the old mine, a wagon with its bed tilted, 3 horses tethered in a position too perfect, like stage props. "It's wrong," Rebecca whispered. "They don't shift. They don't stamp." Her entire body was a listening instrument now. "They're not horses." "Decoys," Hollister breathed. "Eyes forward, guns inward." The first shot came from the mine mouth, a muzzle flash ripping the dark. Ezra shoved her flat, his old strength swift, and returned fire in a measured cadence that sounded like a man counting back from a bad dream. Hollister's men worked west and east along the lip, pinning anyone who showed a foolish shoulder in the entrance. Powder smoke crawled and swelled, bitter and harsh. Rebecca reloaded Ezra's rifle with hands that didn't shake until the brass clicked home, then steadied. She knew why. The body recognizes purpose and comes like a good horse when called. And then, impossible and true, shots sounded from inside the mine that were aimed inward, and voices pitched from certainty to panic. A figure appeared at the threshold, swaying, one arm clamped to his side. He was taller than his pain allowed him to remember, and too stubborn to fall. "Hollister!" he called, voice frayed to a single thread. "You men finished wasting your ammunition?" Silas. She was moving before anyone could stop her, down the slope, across the space where a bullet had just chosen not to pass. She reached him at the mouth of the mine and took his weight over her shoulder with a strength that surprised them both. He smelled of dirt and iron and the same clean soap he used on his hands after he worked the traps. His cheek, under the bruises, was warm. "We had an appointment," he managed, a smile trying to tow the pain. "I'm late." "You're here," she said. "That's on time for the living." She pressed her palm to his side, where his shirt had darkened, the heat of blood finding her. "Knife?" "Porter's handwriting," he said, leaning on the wall, as Hollister and Harrison flanked them, covering their retreat. "Said I wouldn't be needing all my blood where I was going." He coughed once, and then straightened as if memory required dignity. "He's headed north, Montana. A man named Whitfield in Helena owes him a favor. He said it out loud like a lesson because he believed he'd enjoy the last word." "Not tonight he won't," Hollister said, eyes scanning the tree line for any remice of trouble. "We take you to Harkins." "Harkins?" Rebecca asked, keeping pace. "Trapper," Ezra said, coming up at her elbow, breath easy despite the climb. "Stitches a man like he mends his own boots. Tight." Harkins's cabin smelled of tallow and peppermint, and the kind of cleanliness born not from fuss, but from respect for how bodies heal. The old man looked at Silas once, nodded, and rolled his sleeves. "Knife work. Deep, but it missed the lung out of mercy or carelessness. Hard to tell with villains. Hold him," he told Rebecca, and she did, not as a restraint, but as a tether. Silas kept his eyes on hers while Harkins cleaned the wound. When the needle bit, his breath cut short. She lifted her free hand and set it on his brow, as if the cool of her skin could tell the fire to subside. "Almost," Harkins said, in the tone of a man who knows the truth can carry a person further than a lie. When it was done and bandaged, when the marshals had posted a quiet ring around the cabin and Ezra had taken the first watch as if time meant little to his bones, the room emptied of necessity. Rebecca ladled broth into a cup and brought it to Silas's lips. He took it in small sips, each a negotiation with pride and need. The lamplight made the polished grain of the table glow and set a warp of gold along the stitches at his side. "You came," he said after a while. "Of course," she answered, and the simplest honesty warmed them both. "You told me where to meet you if the world went dark." He studied her face, as if memorizing a map no one could steal, and then his gaze fell to her hand where it lay on the blanket, pale against the brown. He covered it with his own. "Judge?" "Warrants are written," she said. "The ledger is singing all the names it knows. The song isn't sweet, but it's true." He exhaled. The release was not relief alone. It was a long-held tension, unspooling carefully, as if the spine itself had been waiting to lay down a portion of its burden. "Catherine," he said, not questioning any more, but granting a place among the circle of the remembered. "She will have justice," Rebecca said, and the words were a vow the room agreed to keep. They slept in shifts, the fire cupped low to conserve wood. At some hour, when dark felt thinner and the morning wasn't yet sure of itself, Rebecca woke to find Silas watching her, his eyes softer than any she had known from him. He did not speak. He didn't need to. She sat up and moved to the edge of his pallet and lay her head lightly near his shoulder where she could listen to his breathing. There is a kind of love that announces itself. There is another kind that arrives without fanfare and simply sets about its tasks, warming, watching, counting the stitches and the days, making sure the person beside you understands that they are not alone inside their life. This, now, was that second kind. By noon the next day, the judge's men had Caldwell and 2 of Porter's lieutenants in irons. Word came in, carried by a deputy with a grin held tightly in place, lest joy look like gloating. The ledger had done what it was made to undo. It had broken a chain. Women from the Golden Spike were taken into rooms where a matron's hands did not traffic in shame, but in tea and blankets, and questions asked with care. The town felt different, as if a splinter lodged in its flesh had been drawn out, and, though the wound stung, it could imagine mending. Porter, though, was smoke. He moved as he always had, swift, practiced, arrogant enough to leave a trace because he believed traces belonged to men who lacked his means. The judge wired Helena. Hollister sent men to the crossings and the wayside stations where a runner could change a horse and not be asked his name. The map on the marshal's wall sprouted pins, a constellation of watchfulness. Silas argued to stand, then walk, then ride. Harkins told him he could do each if he also promised to rest after, as if rest were part of the doing. He compromised by pacing the length of the cabin 3 times, his hand light along the chair backs, and then letting Rebecca guide him to the pallet again. His stubbornness was not about proving pain weak. It was about informing himself he still had his legs under him. She told him he did. And when he believed her, the pain seemed to draw back 1 inch, as if reason had more authority than fear. "What will you do," she asked that evening, "when the trail thins, when Porter is a letter, a wire, a rumor carried on a wind?" His eyes traced the line where wall met ceiling, as if the answer might be written there by lamplight itself. "I've been a knife aimed at one man a long time," he said. "You can forget your hand was made for other work." "Perhaps your hand remembers more than it lets on," she replied. "I've seen it build and mend and lift. I've seen it steady a gun so a woman could learn not to fear it. I've seen it write letters that turned grief into something that could live on a page." He absorbed that the way dry wood absorbs oil, slowly, usefully, becoming more itself. "And you?" he asked. "What will you do when the court has taken your voice and used it properly, and the town has given you back your lungs?" "I could study law," she said, trying the words on her tongue. "Or medicine." She smiled. "Or I could learn to frame a wall that won't buckle when wind leans its whole weight on it." "The west wall," he said, playing along with a gentleness she had earned. "Never liked the way it looked back." "Then we will take it down and set it right," she said. The we sat there between them, an ember on a hearth, small, sufficient, promising heat enough if fed. They returned to Rapid City in a small procession that made no noise because it didn't need to. Ezra rode at point, humming something under his breath that had no melody she recognized and yet soothed the horses. Harkins walked the first mile beside Silas and then waved them on, his duty done, his pride tucked away like a sharpened tool. The marshal's office door looked the same, but when Hollister opened it, the place felt different. Not because of furniture, but because of the air a righteous fight leaves behind when the first round of it is won. Inside, Judge Harmon unfolded a piece of paper and looked at Silas over its edge. "The governor asks if you'd take a badge and the work that goes with it," he said. "He also asks if you'd prefer another kind of service entirely, one that pays quieter but builds more. The territory has need of men who know where rot starts and how to shore against it." Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked to Rebecca, and the look itself felt like a taking of counsel. She didn't tell him what to do. She reached for his hand and left her fingers open there. He nodded once to the judge. "I'll think like a man who plans to stay." "I haven't done that in 5 years. Give me till the west wall stands up proper." The judge smiled, a small, honest thing. "The wall will tell you," he said. "Good walls do." Evenings, while Porter's name rode the wires like a sparrow that wouldn't light, they walked the town's edges where the prairie begins and the light loosens its hold. They spoke of small things that meant large things if you had lived without them. Bread that rose, a chair that didn't wobble, a ridge where you could see 2 weather systems deciding how to share the sky. When they did not speak, the quiet between them felt like a held hand, present, anchoring, unafraid of how long a road could be. And when she woke one night to rain on the window and thought of flames that had taken houses she had never seen but had learned to love because he loved them, she slid from bed and crossed the small room to his. He lifted the quilt without a word. They lay with their foreheads touching and let the weather pass. There are nights a body asks not for answers, but for proof that someone else will be there to hear the thunder roll and say, without drama, "I am still here." The rhythm of his breathing answered. Her hand on his chest answered back. By the time the first day of testimony was set, the ledger had become less a book than a country. A place the court would enter, walk, and leave, with mud on its boots that wouldn't wash away. Rebecca folded her dress over the chair back, smoothed the worn fabric, and thought of the cabin waiting in the hills, of the west wall leaning like a person who has not yet found how to stand square. She closed her eyes and could feel the grain of the logs under her palm, the way the chisel bites and then relents, the sting in the shoulder, the clean satisfaction when a notch marries true. Tomorrow would be for law. Tonight was for rest made beside the person whose presence had taught her that love was not a luxury, but a way of breathing more air than fear permits. She slid beneath the quilt and let the dark be simple. And as sleep came, she felt the story they had carried through danger settle for a moment in the hollow between one day and the next. Not finished, not safe forever, but alive and moving toward a dawn that promised work and warmth both. Outside, the wind lifted in the cottonwoods the way hands sometimes lift in blessing. Inside, 2 people who had been alone a long time lay within reach of each other and trusted morning to find them where they were. The courthouse smelled of oiled wood and paper. Clean, dry, a scent that speaks of order even when the world outside strains against it. Morning gathered at the tall windows, spreading a pale wash across the benches where townspeople sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes bright with the kind of hope that doesn't dare name itself yet. The judge took his seat with the gravity of a man who had watched too many seasons of men testing boundaries and who still believed in fences that held. Rebecca stood when called. Her palms were steady on the rail, steadier than she had expected, as if the long miles here had taught her hands a sturdiness the rest of her would grow into. Judge Harmon's gaze met hers, firm, human. Marshal Hollister nodded once, a soldier's blessing offered without flourish. She opened the ledger to the page she had marked the night before and began to speak. She did not falter. She didn't embroider, didn't twist, didn't spare. Names, dates, roots, sums, logged with a businessman's neatness and a soul's vacancy. The room listened the way a field listens when rain begins, quiet awe that the dry might end. When she reached Catherine Morgan, Rebecca set her forefinger to the entry as if she were pressing a seed into the earth. "My mother," she said, and the judge's pen paused but did not stop. Across the aisle, a woman in a grey shawl pressed a hand to her mouth and wept without sound. Rebecca kept going, voice low and clear, the cadence of truth when it refuses to hurry, the gentleness of healing when it refuses to be sentimental. When she finished, the judge bowed his head the smallest degree, as if to the dead, and then raised it to the living. "Let the warrants be read," he said, and the clerk's voice found a rhythm like hammer to nail. "Colonel Nathaniel Porter, Victor Caldwell." And the litany of names that had once been whispered in saloons now rang in oak and sunlight. The room breathed out. Something shifted in the town's bones. Silas came in under his own power, bandage neat under his shirt, colour pale, but his eyes iron. He stood at the back beside Ezra, who rested a hand on the bench to quiet the tremor a long night leaves in an old shoulder. When Rebecca stepped down, she didn't go to the front pew. She went to Silas, and the small smile he gave her was not for show. It was the smile of a man who had found a place to rest his vow and discovered it had the shape of a woman's steadfastness. By noon the deputies had Caldwell in irons, and two of his clerks blinking at the light like men who had forgotten the sky was not owned by anyone with a ledger. The afternoon brought witnesses who had never been allowed to be witnesses to their own lives. A laundress with a scar fine as a hairline along her jaw. A stable boy who remembered the pattern on a glove because it had struck him when he moved too slow. A doctor who had signed certificates that did not sit right on his conscience, now scratching out his complicity word by word in a voice that would not crack, because a crack would be another failure. Porter was not among the captured. He was heir with a plan in it. News came with the evening. 2 riders seen at the North Crossing, a coach hired under a false name, a telegraph from Helena with a reply colder than the mountains and quick as a rattle. Whitfield had sent a man to meet a friend of a friend. Porter was moving faster, using every mile of money a man can wield when his debts are not written on paper. The judge recessed, but the fight did not. Maps unrolled. Pins bit. Messages flew. When the courthouse emptied, the street filled with a different kind of light. Lamplight in eyes, candles held in small gatherings, faces that had each decided to be counted. That night, under the cottonwoods where wind makes a soft sound like blessing, Ezra sketched an idea into the dust with his stick. "He wants the ledger back," he said. "Wants to believe a book can be made to swallow its own words. He'll chase any shadow that looks like leather and truth." He looked up. "Give him one." "A decoy," Hollister said. "Coach, driver, 2 marshals inside. A second coach with the real ledger and a judge headed the other way." "He'll smell law from a mile," Ezra said. "But he won't smell love. Let the decoy be the law. Let the real be the quiet things men like him never learned to reckon with. A woman's memory and a man who knows his mountains." Rebecca's gaze moved from the stick drawing to Silas. "There's the old trestle at Crooked Fork," she said, seeing it in her mind. The long spine of timber, the echo underfoot, the way sound tells you who is behind you before sight does. He'll take height and spectacle if he sees it. He likes rooms that make him feel large. Silas's mouth drew into a line that meant his decision had arrived before his words. "I'll be the driver," he said. "If Porter wants to look a man in the eyes when he steals what isn't his, he can have mine." He turned to Rebecca, and the whole world narrowed to the exchange that passed between them in that moment. Warning, plea, promise, and the bright thread that ties two lives into one rope. You take the real coach, Ezra, with you. The old tank road over the ridge. If you don't hear from me by dawn—" She shook her head. "By dawn you'll be drinking coffee I make too strong, and you'll say it's perfect because it's hot and because you can tell I'm watching your face." It wasn't bravado. It was a benediction disguised as ordinary. Near midnight, the sky low and thick with stars, the plan went into motion. The decoy coach rolled out first, leather creaking, Hollister inside with a deputy, the false ledger on his lap, looking true as sin. Rebecca and Ezra waited in the black seam of trees with the real book wrapped in plain canvas and tied under the seat, horses stomping at mosquitoes, and the faint smell of creosote that always clung to trestles and plans. At Crooked Fork, the night felt hollow. The trestle stood above the gulch like a thought a man regrets but can't unsay. Silas sat high on the driver's box, reins light in his hands. He heard them before he saw them, the careful hoofbeats of men who believe distance is a guarantee, the murmur of a rider pretending his breath is easy. Porter came into view on a dark horse that had cost more than a family's winter wood, coat neat, hat angled, arrogance sharpened by the stars. "Evening," Porter called lightly, as if they were men who met to exchange handshakes and staggers. Silas drew the coach to a halt on the trestle's spine. "You're late," he said, and didn't smile. Porter's eyes flicked over the coach, to the shadows where a second man might be, to the shape under the tarp that would be ledger-shaped if truth wore tar. He tipped his head to the two riders who flanked him. "Take it," he said, as if ordering soup. Hollister's deputy moved inside the coach as rehearsed, making a noise that sounded like a locked box giving up. Silas's fingers slid to the little plunger wired under the seat, the charges set earlier where the trestle met rock, the kind that would not blow a mountain but would make a bridge think hard about standing. He had wired it himself, hands steady, jaw tight, Ezra murmuring, "Only if you must, son," as if stating an old law. The first rider came close, too close. Silas could smell his sweat, the sour of a man who lives on whiskey and pride. Porter shifted in the saddle, letting his horse's iron step sound like punctuation. He wanted the moment to be theatre. He wanted to watch the law bend. Silas pressed the plunger. The blast wasn't grand. It was enough. A section of trestle near the far end sagged with a long groan, timbers slipping like a tired prayer, rails twisting into an iron grin. The coach lurched, half the wheels still on sound structure, half seeking air. Horses screamed, then steadied under Silas's voice. "Easy, easy." Calm poured like water. Porter's mount danced, and his eyes flared with something that cut clean through his polish. Fear. "Marshal!" Silas shouted, voice meant for Hollister, but carried to anyone ready to hear orders instead of panic. "Out! Down! West side!" Hollister and his man rolled from the coach to the safe side, hitting wood and then the narrow service plank running along the trestle's flank. Silas, through the reins, scrambled toward the rear as the coach tilted further. Porter's second rider drew and fired, bullets shrieking off iron, splinters stinging. Silas felt the heat of one kiss his ribs and go on, the memory of a cave and a knife lighting his nerves to keep him upright. Porter cursed, the refined edges gone. "Take him!" he snarled, and spurred toward the gap, misjudging wood that had served men longer than he had. His horse slipped, caught, leapt. The animal's courage saved them for a heartbeat, long enough for a shadow from the rocks to stand and aim with dignity, not anger. Ezra fired once. Porter reeled, not from a wound, but from the shot's intent, the message in it that said, "We are finished pretending you are the largest thing in the room." Silas reached the rear of the coach and cut the traces. The horses lunged free, then stood as if the night itself had told them to. The coach groaned again, a body that had accepted a verdict. He could jump and live. He could ride it down and maybe not. He looked once toward the pines, toward the dark road where a second coach would now be taking a quieter path to a brighter dawn. He thought of a bed that smelled of smoke and cedar, of a book of poetry with a mother's notes, of a woman's voice reading until the dark was smaller. He whispered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps just her name, and threw himself toward the west plank as the coach gave up and fell. He missed. Fingers scraped iron. The world became sound. Wood splitting, metal complaining, the deep, yawning gulp of a ravine taking what gravity offered. Silas caught a bolt with the crook of his arm. Pain flared white. His shoulder shrieked. He swung, boots kicking air, and found a ledge with one boot and then the other, a place no wider than a book laid flat. He pressed himself to rock and breathed in short, measured sips. Above him, the trestle cracked but held. Below, the coach slammed, coughed dust, went still. "Silas!" Hollister's voice, strained. "Hold!" "I've been," he managed through his teeth. "Don't you hurry meaningfully on my account." A shape moved along the plank. Careful, sure, the movement of someone who had rehearsed on a different stage. Wind in logs, pines in weather. Rebecca. She had left the second road. She had read something in the night the men had not. She edged along, grip steady, skirts bound up, eyes fixed. "I have you," she said, not as a hope, but as a plan. She dropped the coil of a rope. It struck his shoulder, and pain flashed again. He bit back the noise and looped it under his arms with a speed that came from 100 mornings tying gear. "On 3, she said, and then, because 3 was too long in a life this narrow, on 1. They pulled. Ezra on the rope, Hollister anchoring, Rebecca braced, her jaw set in that way he had come to understand meant she had chosen her course, and the world would kindly fall in line. The rock scraped his back. The bolt tore his sleeve and a strip of skin that would later remind him of this night with a sting that would turn to a smile. He came over the lip and onto wood with the gracelessness of the saved, and she went to her knees beside him and put her forehead against his, breath quick, tears bright and unashamed. "Hi," he said, ridiculous and holy. "You owe me coffee," she answered, and the men laughed, because laughter is what the living get to do when the dead have been denied their due. They bound Porter's lieutenant where he lay cursing. The colonel himself had vanished into the dark like the kind of coward who prefers legend to capture. But his circle was broken, his roots mapped and ruined, his ledger sung to men who would not be bought. The trestle, wounded and still standing, watched them go with the imperturbable patience of wood. The stars continued their silent work. By dawn, the real coach had reached a relay where Law's hands were waiting. Judge Harmon read the wire with eyes that warmed as if a hearth took new wood. Decoy burned, bridge damaged, ledger safe, Winters alive, Porter escaped wounded. Pursuit continues. He held the paper to his heart, one slow beat, before passing it to Mrs. Hollister, who folded it with the care of a woman who knows good news can be fragile if you pinch it too hard. Silas slept that day, hard, reluctant, and when he woke, Rebecca was sitting beside his bed with her mother's book open and a cup of broth cooling between her palms. "You always find me in the worst rooms," he said, voice rough, not complaining, just registering truth. "I follow the sound you make when you pretend you're fine," she said. "It's loud as a bell." He smiled without moving anything that hurt. "We'll get him." "We will," she said, "but the getting will not be the end. It never is. The end is what we build when the running is done." He looked at her hand on the quilt, pale and capable. He set his palm over it, their fingers finding the weave that had become familiar. The noise of pursuit faded in the hallway outside, men striding, orders given, paper rattling, and inside the room an opposite thing gathered. A quiet so deep it felt like soil ready for seed. Healing can be that way, not an end to pain, but a beginning that insists on itself until life bends toward it. The next days braided tenderness to purpose. Rebecca testified again, this time reading aloud the lines Judge Harmon assigned, entries whose ink could not deny itself when spoken in a clear woman's voice under God's daylight. Silas met with men who had long carried badges like burdens and now wanted to carry them like tools. Ezra brought news each evening, little parcels wrapped in dust and cigar smoke, eyes twinkling as if mischief were a sacrament. "Whitfield's man has a limp now," he reported. "Horse took issue with a spur at the wrong moment." A sermon, if ever I saw one. At night, when the courthouse emptied and the town unspooled its nerves under the comfort of lamps and bread, Rebecca and Silas walked the strip of prairie where the houses thinned and the sky took over. They did not always speak of Porter. Sometimes they spoke of a roof angle in need of deciding, of a shelf to be carved near the hearth for a book that had cost her nothing and everything, of a slate on which 4 names waited for 2 more, living ones, to stand beside them. He told her the forest was different at dawn, and she promised to wake early and learn the difference by walking in it. She told him coffee tasted better when the first cup was shared in silence, and he promised to be quiet, at least until the second. On the 7th morning, a telegram came from north of the line. A marshal in Helena had taken a man matching Porter's description in a rail yard where a gentleman should not have been skulking. He had bled on a white shirt and sworn at a porter, and both of those acts had given him away. Somehow it always ended like this, not with a trumpet, but with a clumsy miscalculation a smaller man would not have made. The judge closed his eyes briefly, then opened them to the room that had waited to breathe. "Bring him home," he said. Silas did not ride with the men who went to fetch the colonel. He did not need to. The law had a spine again, and it didn't require his shoulder to hold it upright. He sat on the courthouse steps with Rebecca, the ledger on the judge's desk behind them, safe not because of a lock, but because of what had happened in men's hearts. The sun tipped higher. A breeze wandered through, carrying the smell of lilacs from someone's yard and the hum of a woman singing to a baby who would never know the names in that book, but would live in a town freer because they had been read. "I thought it would feel like ending," he said quietly. "It feels like beginning to me," she replied, "like the first true morning after a hard winter. The snow is still melting, there's mud, but look, the ground is soft enough for seeds." He turned his head, studied her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the kindness in the set of her mouth. "Then we'll plant," he said, "one wall at a time, one board, one hand on another. And when the west wall stands," she said, smiling, "we'll hang the slate where we can see it." "And write what?" he asked, already suspecting. "Not the past," she said gently. "The future." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their fingers interlacing with the ease of practice and the wonder of firsts. Across the square, a farmer's wagon rattled past, a couple of boys shouting and then shushing themselves because a courthouse is not a place for yelling. A dog stretched in the shade and sighed as if the town's new posture suited him. It was an ordinary day carrying extraordinary cargo, and the heart, surprised by relief, chose to be grateful instead of suspicious. By evening, as the sun slid down and made a long river of light along the street, a deputy returned at a gallop, hat in hand, face flushed. "They've got him," he called, breathless, voice jumping oaks. "2 days out, under guard. No brags left in him." A murmur went up. Relief, grief, the strange ache of justice when it finally puts its hand on a shoulder and says, "Enough." Rebecca turned to Silas, and for a moment neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The work behind them had been hard. The work ahead of them would be quieter only if they made it so. But between the two lay a small meadow of rest, and they stepped into it together. He leaned in and kissed her. No performance, no claim, just a plain sealing of what had been lived. It tasted like breath after running and water after dust, and the sweetness that lingers in a room where goodness has been allowed. Night came soft. Somewhere a fiddle practiced a tune until it found itself. In the window of the marshal's office, the ledger rested, closed, not because it was hidden, but because the day had read enough for one turn of the earth. In a cabin in the hills, a west wall leaned as if listening. Tomorrow they would return to it with tools and laughter and the quiet knowledge that some storms are weathered not by standing against them alone, but by building something so steady, so warm, the wind moves around it and goes on. And beyond that wall, beyond the ridge where the pines make a black seam against the sky, the future waited with its sleeves rolled, the kind of waiting that is also an invitation. The ride back to the mountains carried a different weight than the journeys that had brought them down into the towns and courts. Before, they had ridden with fear at their backs and the fire of justice burning too hot in their veins. Now, as the horses moved at a steady pace up through the pine-shadowed trails, the silence was gentler, a silence that let the mind breathe and the heart unfurl. The ledger was no longer hidden under Rebecca's arm. It was locked in a courthouse, guarded not just by iron keys, but by the will of people who had heard the truth and decided to stand with it. Porter was in chains at last, his name stripped of grandeur, his arrogance weighed down by the simple weight of justice. The chase was over. Silas rode a little slower than before, his shoulders still stiff from the wounds of Black Rock Canyon, but he carried himself with a steadiness that made Rebecca ache in a sweet way. She knew the cost of every scar, every limp, every night when his breath came too shallow in sleep, haunted by dreams of fire. But she also knew, because she felt it each time his gaze softened when it met hers, that he was no longer carrying the burden alone. He had been forged by loss. But now he was tempered by something new, something healing, the kind of love that does not erase pain, but teaches it how to live alongside joy. When the cabin came into view, its canvas wall flapping lightly in the wind, Rebecca pressed her hand against her chest as though to still her racing heart. Home. Not the house her father had kept, with its cold rooms and colder rules, not the saloons or streets where she had been treated like coin. This rough, unfinished cabin, with its gaps to be filled, its walls to be reinforced, and its hearth waiting to burn bright, that was home. She glanced at Silas, and he nodded, as if answering her thought without needing words. They dismounted together. The horses drank from the stream, tails flicking at flies. Silas pushed open the cabin door and stood aside for her, a gesture that would have been unremarkable to some, but to Rebecca it was sacred. Permission, respect, partnership. She stepped inside and breathed deeply. The scent of pine logs, earth, and smoke lingered like a promise. Her hands moved to touch everything, the table, the shelves, the quilt folded neatly. She felt the life they had already built here, and the one waiting to grow. In the days that followed, the cabin became their shared project, every stroke of an axe and every stitch of fabric binding them tighter together. Silas showed her how to brace the west wall so it would not lean when storms pressed against it. She showed him how to balance accounts with neat rows of numbers so he could trade fairly with trappers and townsfolk. When they tired, they sat on the porch and watched the valley change color with the sky, shoulders brushing, cups of coffee steaming between their palms. They spoke not only of survival, but of future, of planting herbs near the stream, of carving shelves for books, of inviting Ezra when his wandering bones wished for firelight and company. At night, when the fire was low and the world outside was only the hush of owls and the sigh of wind, Rebecca read aloud from her mother's book of poems. Silas would close his eyes, his breathing steadying as though her voice was stitching up old wounds that had long refused to close. Sometimes he would take up his letters, writing still to Hannah and Lily, not because he was trapped in the past, but because love given once deserved to be honored always. And sometimes, when his pen slowed, he would look at Rebecca and let the quiet acknowledgment pass between them. That grief and love could coexist, that healing was not forgetting, but remembering with gentleness. Their love deepened not in grand gestures, but in the everyday weaving of lives together. The way she smoothed the quilt over him when pain kept him from sleep. The way he split wood early so she would never have to shiver in the dawn. The way they argued gently over small things, whether coffee should be boiled twice or once, whether the window should face the sunrise or the valley. Arguments that ended not in bitterness but in laughter, the kind of laughter that reminds two people that they are safe with each other. Spring melted into summer, and with it came renewal. Rebecca planted lavender near the stream in memory of her mother, the air carrying its scent, so that each breeze felt like a touch of the past transformed into blessing. Silas carved a new chair, one wide enough for both of them, and set it by the hearth. Ezra visited, bringing a story of the latest foolish boast he'd heard in town, and stayed long enough to mend his boots by their fire before moving on again. The cabin, once a refuge for one wounded man, became a hearth for many, living proof that love multiplies when shared. One evening, as twilight painted the valley in dusky blues and violets, Rebecca sat on the porch steps, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. Silas joined her, lowering himself carefully beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. They looked out over the trees, silent for a long while, until he finally spoke. "I thought I was finished," he said quietly. "After the fire, after the war, after they were taken. I thought my life had ended, and all that was left was vengeance. But you reminded me that living is more than surviving." His hand found hers, rough fingers curling over delicate ones. "You gave me back the choice to love again." Her throat tightened, but her voice was steady when she answered, "And you gave me the choice no one else ever gave me. To be free, to belong, to live not as property, but as myself. Together we made something new." They leaned into each other, their foreheads touching, hearts beating steady as the stars kindled overhead. In that moment, they were no longer two souls scarred by loss, but two lives bound by trust, tenderness, and the healing work of love. The cabin glowed behind them, its fire steady, its walls holding strong against the night. Beyond it lay the wilderness, vast and untamed, but before them stretched a future they would shape with their own hands. It would not be free of hardship, no life ever is, but it would be rich with something more enduring. The courage to face storms together, and the joy of knowing that every dawn was theirs to share. And so their story, born of fire and sorrow, became one of warmth, healing, and the fierce, tender power of love. If this journey has touched something within you, if Silas and Rebecca's story brought comfort, healing, or hope to your heart, I invite you to let it live on. Leave a comment with your thoughts, share the light of this tale with others, and subscribe so you can walk with us into the next story. Love is meant to be remembered, shared, and carried forward. And with your voice, this story will continue to breathe.